Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania's documented history. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. The once respected Fairmount Medical Institute on North Broad Street in Philadelphia was the scene of an odd incident early on the 17th of October 1913. During his rounds, a night watchman heard strange noises coming from the building's east wing. A gentle tapping followed by what he described as a rhythm of metal against glass. He looked into the matter and discovered nothing strange, save for a single patient chart that had been left on the floor of an empty room. Records showed that the room itself had been empty for weeks. Not what was discovered, but what wasn't, was what made this occurrence so unique. The patient's name had been meticulously scratched out with such force that the paper had torn in the margins, the night watchman reported. The words, written in a hand that seemed to be distinct from the doctor's notes, read, "She knows what they did." Once a source of pride for Philadelphia's medical community, the institute was a massive 4-story brick building with large windows that appeared to be watching over the neighborhood. Built as a general hospital in 1887, the facility was transformed in 1905 to concentrate on long-term care and what were then known as nervous disorders. The Fairmount Medical Institute was well known by 1913 for treating affluent Philadelphians with fatigue, depression, and other unidentified illnesses that families would rather not discuss. Only female patients were kept in the East Wing, where the night watchman had heard the noises. Eleanor Blackwood, a 43-year-old stern nurse who had been employed at Fairmount since it was converted to a specialist hospital, was the East Wing's head nurse at the time. Nurse Blackwood managed her wing with military efficiency and was described by her colleagues as always accurate and committed to order. Having received her training in the country's first hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital, she introduced techniques that some viewed as advanced, while others found disturbing. According to her personal documents, she had never married and had dedicated herself fully to her career during a time when such a commitment from a woman was both respected and regarded with suspicion. For decades, the events that transpired in room 307 of the East Wing, between March and October 1913, would be hidden behind layers of institutional silence and meticulous documentation that showed virtually nothing of substance. The old hospital building's demolition in 1968 was the catalyst for revealing what many had surmised, but no one had confirmed, that something had gone horribly wrong inside Fairmount's honorable walls. If a secret compartment hadn't been found during the building's deconstruction, the tale of Nurse Blackwood and her special treatments may have stayed forgotten. A tiny area behind a fake wall in what had been the medicine storage room next to Nurse Blackwood's office was discovered by workers. There was a leather-bound diary inside, its pages filled with careful calligraphy and its cover faded. After being given to the Philadelphia Historical Society, the magazine was mainly forgotten until 1965, when Thomas Harker, a graduate student, started studying the history of Philadelphia's medical institutions for his PhD thesis. Harker's discoveries would help to piece together one of the most unsettling episodes in Philadelphia medical history, a tale of institutional failure, professional obsession, and the dreadful vulnerability of people entrusted to the care of someone they were supposed to trust. The Blackwood case, as medical historians have come to refer to it, provides insight into the more sinister facets of psychiatric care in the early 20th century, when supervision was at best scant and therapies were experimental. One of the coldest seasons in Philadelphia's history occurred in the late winter of 1913. Although patients in the East Wing frequently complained of lingering drafts, coal furnaces that rumbled in the basement kept the hallways of Fairmount Medical Institute warm. Nurse Blackwood started maintaining a private notebook during this icy season, apart from the official patient logs that the hospital administration requested. The first note, which was written on the 3rd of March 1913, says, "Today marks the beginning of my own study." The doctors are too timid in their approaches. They see only what their medical books tell them to see. I have observed for 15 years now, and I know there are better ways to quiet the troubled mind. Nurse Blackwood gave the public an impression of her professional skills throughout this time. In his quarterly report, Dr. William Thorne, the doctor in charge of the East Wing, said that the patients of Nurse Blackwood demonstrated notable improvements in their overall behavior and adherence to hospital protocols. Blackwood started administering her own illegal therapies during the night shifts when surveillance was at its lowest, which he was unaware of and none of the doctors seemed to be aware of. Blackwood had expressly asked for night duty starting in January 1913, according to hospital employment records, stating that she wanted to give younger nurses the chance to work more desired hours. The administration accepted this ostensibly kind gesture without question. The entire East Wing, which housed about 30 women at any given time, usually had only 2 nurses on the night shift. Blackwood had hours of unsupervised access to her patients, because the majority of them were drugged for the night, and her companion nurse was frequently positioned at the other end of the hallway. Non-official reports, but a letter from a kitchen worker named Mary Sullivan to her sister in April 1913 provided the first clue that something strange was happening in the East Wing. As stated in the letter, which was donated to the Historical Society in 1952 and kept in Sullivan's family files, one woman's hands shake so bad she can't hold her spoon, though Dr. Thorne says her nerves are improving. I don't see how that can be true when her eyes look so hollow and frightened. Sullivan also noted that the patients from upstairs come to breakfast looking worse than when they went to bed. Even if they didn't seem like much at the time, Sullivan's observations matched those in Blackwood's private notebook. A post from April 12 states, Subject 4 shows the most promising response to the night treatments. Her resistance has decreased significantly, and she now exhibits the physical manifestations I had anticipated: tremors, increased perspiration, and a marked difficulty in maintaining eye contact. These are all signs that the mind is becoming receptive. Perhaps out of fear that the notebook could be found, Blackwood never specifically described the night treatments she mentioned in her journal. Though there are sporadic allusions throughout the text, along with later testimony from a patient who survived, it appears that Blackwood was using her own brand of experimental therapy, which included aspects of psychological intimidation, sleep restriction, and sensory manipulation. She seemed to think she could reconstruct a patient's mind in a healthier shape by dismantling their mental defenses, a rudimentary and unapproved version of methods that respectable psychiatry would later develop in more morally acceptable ways. Philadelphia experienced very heavy rainfall in the spring of 1913, and the historic walls of Fairmount Medical Institute were frequently wet with moisture. Particularly in the East Wing, where ventilation had always been inadequate, patients complained of musty and mildew-like smells. Dr. Thorne repeatedly asked for better air circulation in the patient rooms, according to maintenance records. The management said that because of the building's age, such modifications were not feasible without significant renovations. Later on, this environmental element would be crucial in helping to explain how Nurse Blackwood managed to carry out her operations covertly for so many months. Blackwood had honed her strategy by May. Her entry from May 23 states, "The use of the Institute's existing deficiencies has proven most effective." When I explained to Subject 7 that the sounds she heard in the walls were merely her own thoughts becoming audible to others, she became remarkably compliant. She now believes that maintaining absolute mental silence is her only protection. The power of suggestion, combined with the natural creaking of this old building, creates a perfect environment for receptivity. Blackwood described a systematic psychological manipulation technique that used the aged hospital building's natural acoustics to persuade susceptible patients that their private thoughts were somehow being heard by others. This terrible lie would have been extremely unsettling for women who had already been confined for nervous disorders, many of whom probably had real illnesses like anxiety or depression. Dr. Thorne's medical records from this time period show growing perplexity about specific patients. In a letter written to a colleague at Pennsylvania Hospital on the 7th of June 1913, he wrote, "I confess I am somewhat perplexed by the condition of several women under my care. While they demonstrate markedly improved compliance with hospital routines and show none of the emotional outbursts that characterized their earlier stays, they have developed new symptoms that I struggle to categorize. A profound quietness, almost catatonic in nature, yet they respond to direct questions and perform tasks when instructed. It is as though the personality has been drained away, leaving only a shell that functions mechanically. I wonder if this represents a new stage of nervous exhaustion that has not been properly documented in the literature. Thorne's findings fit a pattern that will evolve throughout the course of Blackwood's journal. She was deliberately pursuing women who displayed what she called excessive emotionality, or resistance to proper social frameworks. In contemporary terms, many of these women may have been displaying independence that 1913 society considered unsuitable for their gender, or simply experiencing depression brought on by constrictive social circumstances. However, Blackwood saw these characteristics as abnormal and thought her techniques were addressing risky deviations. Philadelphia experienced intense heat in the summer of 1913, making the circumstances in the ill-ventilated hospital all but intolerable. According to records, 2 senior patients in the West Wing passed away in July from difficulties brought on by the heat. Blackwood described the conditions in the East Wing with clinical objectivity. The extreme temperatures have proven unexpectedly beneficial to my work. The physical discomfort weakens resistance more quickly, allowing for deeper implementation of corrective suggestions. Subject 8 progressed more in 3 nights than Subject 4 did in 3 weeks during the spring. Nurse Blackwood's tactics seem to have become more intense throughout this sweltering summer. In addition to increasing in frequency, her diary entries became increasingly cryptic, frequently employing a shorthand system that Harker, the graduate student who subsequently examined the materials, said was purposefully created to hide the specifics of her actions. Though their precise meaning is still unknown, references to the Silver method and respiratory enhancement are made frequently. It's evident that by August, the East Wing's patient transfers to the Institute's basement-level quiet room were occurring at an abnormally high rate, according to hospital statistics. Supposedly for patients who required less stimulation, this chamber served as a kind of seclusion. 7 women were temporarily moved to this area between August 3 and August 29 for stays of 2 to 5 days. Nurse Blackwood signed all transfer orders, and Dr. Thorne countersigned them. However, further research indicates that Thorne may have falsified his signature on at least 3 of these documents. According to hospital design drawings, the 1 2x1 2-foot silent chamber at the basement level had a single heavy door, no windows, and walls lined with padding material to cut down on noise. It was first created as a temporary treatment for patients who were very agitated, and until the summer of 1913, it had hardly been utilized. Charles Winslow, the hospital administrator, became aware of its unexpectedly high usage and asked to speak with Dr. Thorne about it on September 5. Discussed unusual patient management with T regarding EB's methods. He assures all protocols being followed. Something unsettling nonetheless. Will observe situation. Winslow's personal notes, which were found among his papers after his death in 1937, contain a brief reference to this meeting, but there is no transcript of it. This suggests that while Winslow had concerns about Blackwood's approach, they were insufficient to warrant immediate action. Cooler weather, and the first signs that Blackwood's operations could be uncovered, arrived in September. After a staff member quit, Harriet Winters, a new nurse, was posted to the East Wing. In contrast to her predecessor, Winters was youthful, just out of college, and seemed unfazed by Blackwood's commanding demeanor. According to hospital employment records, Winters received his training at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, where more modern and innovative methods of psychiatric treatment were being used. Nurse Winters reported the first of many incidents involving behaviors she saw in the East Wing on September 18. The report, which is kept in the hospital's administrative files, stated, "Found patient in room 311, Margaret Wilson, in a state of extreme distress at 515A. M patient was pressing herself against the far wall of the room, refusing to speak or make eye contact. When approached, patient began whispering, 'She'll hear you thinking,' repeatedly. Patient's wrists showed evidence of recent restraint, though no restraint order appears in her chart." When questioned, Nurse Blackwood stated the marks were self-inflicted and that the patient had been monitored throughout the night. "I find this explanation inconsistent with the pattern of markings observed. The new nurse is problematic, too curious, too questioning. She lacks understanding of the delicate work being done here. Some minds are not prepared to comprehend methods that appear unconventional, but are in fact advanced. Blackwood's journal entry from the same date indicates that she was aware that Winters posed a threat to her activities. I have requested her transfer to the West Wing, citing her inexperience with our type of patients. In the meantime, greater discretion will be necessary. Blackwood requested that Winters be transferred, but the administration did not take any action. Administrator Winslow had instead started to pay more attention to the East Wing operations, according to a note in his files. Winters' report troubling. Have instructed her to document all irregular observations without confrontation. Thorne seems oddly passive about entire situation. Will make unannounced rounds myself. Early in October 1913, the East Wing crisis approached a breaking point. After being painstakingly maintained for months, Blackwood's journal reveals a lapse from October 3 to October 12. The handwriting looks rushed and less controlled than her typical exact script when entries resume. The note from October 12 states, Subject 9 has proven problematic beyond expectation. The treatment appeared to be proceeding as with the others, but something in her has remained resistant. She observes too much, says too little. I discovered her attempting to communicate with Winters this morning. This represents a significant setback and potential complication. Subject 9 is Elizabeth Harrow, a 32-year-old woman who was taken to Fairmount in late August 1913 for nervous exhaustion after a personal tragedy, according to hospital records. Harrow was a school teacher who had recently lost her husband in a rail tragedy, according to other documents found in the city archives. According to her admitting physician, the trauma of this abrupt loss had caused acute melancholia with features of nervous collapse. Her brother, a Philadelphia businessman, seems to have arranged for her to be admitted to Fairmount in the hopes that medical attention would help her return to her former self. It was not immediately clear from Elizabeth Harrow's medical records what set her apart from Blackwood's earlier victims. Although she was prone to times of deep grief, she was described as agreeable and logical in discourse. Nothing in her first evaluation indicated that she would end up being the one to reveal Blackwood's operations. However, there was a resilience to her that Blackwood had never experienced before, perhaps due to her personal history or psychological composition. Or maybe she just managed to keep enough of her senses to realize what was happening to her. Throughout early October, there was growing concern regarding Harrow's condition, according to Nurse Winters' incident reports. On October 8th, she wrote, Mrs. Harrow appears severely sleep-deprived. When I inquired about her rest, she looked at the ceiling rather than at me and whispered that the night brings the treatments. When asked to elaborate, she became agitated and refused to speak further. Her chart indicates she is receiving standard sedation, but her symptoms suggest otherwise. Mrs. H. came to me when Nurse B was called away, talking very quickly and quietly. She asked if I could make sure she stayed in her room tonight. When I asked why, she said only, she takes me to the room where thoughts echo. Before I could ask further, Nurse B returned, and Mrs. H immediately moved away, looking anxious. Winters recorded in a brief conversation with Harrow on October 10 during afternoon tea in the patient's common room. In both Blackwood's notebook and Winters' reports, the night of October 13 was a major escalation. Winters, who had started to stay late beyond her scheduled time on the occasion, wrote, At approximately 9:45 p.m., I was completing paperwork in the nurses' station when I heard a commotion from room 309. Upon investigation, I found Nurse Blackwood attempting to administer an injection to Mrs. Harrow, who was resisting forcefully. When questioned, Nurse B stated it was merely a sedative ordered by Dr. Thorne. Mrs. H called out that she was being given the special medicine that makes walls transparent. Nurse B dismissed this as delusion. I requested to see the medication order, at which point Nurse B became hostile and ordered me to return to my duties, stating she would handle the situation. Blackwood's journal entry from the following day provides an additional viewpoint. Interference from W has become intolerable. Subject 9 was on the verge of breakthrough tonight, the resistance finally beginning to fracture when the interruption occurred. The depth of misunderstanding is profound. these methods require precision and privacy. The institutional framework increasingly impedes rather than facilitates progress. Alternative arrangements must be considered. It appears from the events of October 14 and 15 that Blackwood knew her position was in danger. She requested 2 days of personal absence, citing a family issue according to hospital records. During her absence, Nurse Winters recorded substantial improvements in Elizabeth Harrow's health. Mrs. H slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Upon waking, she appeared more alert and coherent than I have previously observed. When assured of privacy, she spoke at length about her experiences, describing what she called night sessions, in which Nurse B would wake her after midnight and sometimes relocate her to the basement room or to a small storage closet on the 3rd floor. She claims that during these sessions, Nurse B would speak to her for hours about the permeability of minds and how thoughts can be extracted and replaced. Mrs. H also reports being deprived of water during these sessions and occasionally being restrained. Winters made the uncommon decision to have the patient sign a statement detailing her detailed talk with Harrow. Then, evidently worried that the paper may be deleted or changed if Blackwood found it, she put a copy in her personal files instead of the official patient record. Later on, the investigation would depend heavily on this precaution. The atmosphere in the East Wing was strained on the evening of October 16, when Blackwood returned to duty. She spent an extraordinary amount of time going over patient files and medication, paying special attention to Elizabeth Harrow's records, according to the night orderly's log. The orderly reported that Blackwood had dismissed him early at around 11:30 p.m., saying she would take care of any lingering responsibilities herself. This was the final documented account of what she had done that evening. Staff testimonies, Blackwood's journal, and ultimately Elizabeth Harrow's own narrative would later be used to piece together what transpired in the hours that followed. According to the most thorough reconstruction, Blackwood entered Harrow's room around midnight with the goal of relocating her to the quiet room in the basement, most likely in preparation for her last therapy session with the increasingly unruly patient. Harrow later stated that she had been pretending to sleep when Blackwood had gone into her room. I heard her footsteps in the hall. I had learned to recognize them and kept my eyes closed. She stood beside the bed for several minutes, just watching. Then she said in that soft voice she used during treatments, "Elizabeth, it's time for your special session. Tonight, we'll complete the process." I knew if I went with her, especially after having spoken to Nurse Winters, something terrible would happen. So when she leaned over to help me up, I pushed past her and ran into the hallway. Harrow characterized what transpired as a frantic chase through the dimly lit East Wing halls. I ran toward the nurse's station, hoping someone would be there, but it was empty. Nurse Blackwood was behind me, calling my name in that same calm voice, telling me I was having an episode and needed assistance. I knew the main doors to the wing would be locked at that hour, so I fled into the storage area near the back stairs, hiding among the linen shelves. The ensuing altercation was only partially recorded. Around 5:30 a.m., a laundry worker who had arrived early for work claimed to have heard shouted voices and a smash that sounded like something large falling from the storage area. She looked around and discovered the room was a mess, with linen all over the floor and shelves overturned. Blackwood and Harrow were nowhere to be seen. About half an hour later, the night watchman, who was on his last rounds before the morning shift came, heard the odd tapping noises coming from a patient room that was empty. He found the abandoned chart with its name scratched out and the menacing message in the margin that read, "She knows what they did." Elizabeth Harrow had returned to her room at 6 in the morning, clearly shaken but physically unharmed by the time Nurse Winters arrived for her morning shift. But Blackwood was nowhere to be seen. Her personal items were still in her office, and there was no indication in the night log that she had signed out. At first, Harrow was reluctant to talk when Winters asked him what had happened, always looking at the ceiling and walls as if he was afraid of being overheard. The complete story came to light only after Winters had assured Harrow of her privacy and relocated her to the little examination room off the main nurse's station. Mrs. H claimed that after hiding in the linen area, Nurse B found her and tried to give her an injection by force. Shelving units were knocked over during the struggle, making enough noise for Nurse B to worry about being found. According to Mrs. H., Nurse B then shifted strategies and assured her that nothing more would occur that evening provided she went back to her room in silence. Mrs. H. consented, but instead of going straight back to her room, she was able to sneak into the empty room 312 and hide there until she thought Nurse B had left. She found a patient chart while hiding and, trying to alert others, scrawled a note and scratched out the name. When she heard Nurse B coming, she ran back to her own room and used a furniture to block the door till morning. Winter's mounting concerns about the East Wing prompted him to report this claim right away to Administrator Winslow, who had arrived early that day. Winslow gave the order to hunt for Nurse Blackwood right away, but she was never found. Staff found that her office had been partially cleared during this search. While some of her possessions were still there, her personal medical bag was gone, and some files were missing. But the most unsettling finding was in the tiny medicine room next to Blackwood's office. Upon closer inspection, a freshly plastered piece of the wall sounded hollow when tapped in comparison to the surrounding areas. Upon opening this part, investigators discovered a tiny area that appeared to have served as a hiding place for Blackwood's private journal and unapproved documents. There was the journal, but it looked like some of the pages had been ripped out in a hurry. A wedding ring, a locket with a family photo, and numerous handwritten letters that ought to have been in patient files or delivered to their intended recipients were among the personal belongings that seemed to have been stolen from patients. There were also a number of tiny bottles of unlabeled medications that weren't included in the hospital's approved formulary. It was evident by the middle of the morning on October 17 that Nurse Eleanor Blackwood had left the hospital. The institution's fear of a scandal was reflected in the citywide alert sent to local authorities, which described her as a person of interest in a hospital investigation rather than directly accusing her of patient mistreatment. In the days that followed, no sign of Blackwood was discovered in Philadelphia, despite this warning. This lead was never verified, but on October 17, a clerk at the Pennsylvania Railroad station claimed to have seen a woman who fit her description getting on an early morning train to New York. On October 18, the hospital board called an emergency meeting to discuss the matter. Concern for patient welfare is weighed against institutional prestige and legal culpability, as the meeting's transcript makes clear. When presented with Winters's documentation and the evidence discovered in Blackwood's hiding place, Dr. Thorne, who had been called upon to explain his oversight failures, shifted to asserting that any irregular procedures must have been Blackwood's independent actions, carried out without his knowledge or approval. He insisted that he had no knowledge of any improper treatments and suggested that patient accounts were probably the result of confusion or delusion. Perhaps sensing the seriousness of the institutional breakdown, Administrator Winslow pushed for openness. "Gentlemen, we must acknowledge that serious breaches of protocol occurred under our supervision. While Nurse Blackwood appears to have been the primary actor, our systems failed to detect her activities for months. We have a responsibility to our current patients and to the public to address this matter directly." However, the majority of board members disagreed, voicing worries about possible legal action and harm to the hospital's reputation in the community. The agreement that was struck was both practical and morally dubious. The board decided to tighten monitoring, especially for night personnel, and carry out a comprehensive internal inquiry. They put Dr. Thorne on administrative leave while they reviewed the situation and authorized Nurse Blackwood's immediate termination, even though she had already escaped. They specifically denied any public disclosure or external authorities' involvement, arguing that unsupported claims based mainly on the testimonies of mentally fragile patients would be counterproductive and could permanently impair the institution's capacity to care for patients in the future. The hospital and Blackwood's victims suffered serious repercussions as a result of this internal handling of the situation. There was no incentive to fine Blackwood or hold her responsible for her acts in the absence of a formal criminal probe. No official recognition of their experiences or specialist care to address any potential long-term psychological repercussions were given to the patients who had undergone her treatments. Perhaps most importantly, Blackwood's notebook indicated that she intended to continue her activities elsewhere, and failing to notify other medical facilities could have put more vulnerable people at risk. The fallout was difficult for Elizabeth Harrow, whose opposition had finally brought Blackwood's actions to light. According to hospital records, she stayed at Fairmount until December 1913, when she was treated by a new doctor who saw that she was making good progress on her initial problem but was displaying new concerns about receiving care in an institution. After being released, she went back to live in Germantown, a residential area in northwest Philadelphia, with her brother's family. According to city directory records, she never went back to teaching. Instead, she started working as a bookkeeper for her brother's company. Harrow's case is noteworthy because, in contrast to the majority of Blackwood's victims, she eventually talked about her experiences in public. 14 years after the events at Fairmount, in 1927, Harrow gave a thorough description to a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer who was doing research for a series on mental health care improvements. The resulting article, which described the irregular treatments at an unnamed private hospital, was very limited, but it was the first time that something immoral had been acknowledged by the public. News of another case involving a nurse at a Boston clinic who had been fired for experimental treatments of female patients reportedly inspired Harrow to speak up. "When I read of what happened in Boston, I could not remain silent. The similarities were too striking to be coincidental. I have long suspected that she simply moved elsewhere and continued what she had started with us. If my account prevents even one woman from enduring what we did at Fairmount, then whatever discomfort comes from revisiting those memories will be worthwhile." Harrow wrote in a later letter to her brother that was preserved in family papers donated to the Historical Society in 1942. It has never been proven beyond a reasonable doubt whether Blackwood was the nurse in the Boston case. Although no images were published to support the identification, the name Eleanor Black, which may have been a shortened form of Blackwood, was reported in Boston newspapers. What is known is that, like Blackwood in Philadelphia, the Boston nurse vanished before formal accusations could be brought. If they were the same individual, it points to a troubling trend of switching between institutions when exposure was likely to occur, a trend that may have persisted after these two recorded cases. One of the most disturbing parts of this case is still what happened to Nurse Eleanor Blackwood. No conclusive record of her life beyond October 1913 has been found, despite decades of journalistic and historical investigations. No death certificate, no census entry, and no property records in any state seem to confirm her information, suggesting that she has disappeared from official records. Because of her absence, some researchers have theorized that she may have changed her name or even departed the nation, bringing her unsettling practices with her to regions where records were not as carefully maintained or have since been lost. Little specific information regarding Blackwood's plans can be found in the last pages of her journal, which were left over after she reportedly deleted several entries before running away. The most recent complete entry, dated October 15, reads, "Preparations must be made quickly. The environment has become unsuitable for continued work. Subject 9's resistance has created unforeseen complications, and W's interference cannot be tolerated much longer. However, the knowledge gained remains valuable. 14 subjects have provided sufficient data to refine the method. Application in a different setting, with improved protocols for subject selection and isolation, should yield better results. The work is too important to abandon merely because of institutional limitations." This entry provides a terrifying look into Blackwood's mental state, due to its clinical disinterest and total lack of regret. She saw her patients' psychological distress as nothing more than data points in her unapproved experiments, rather than as suffering human beings. The mention of 14 subjects raises the possibility that her operations went even farther than what the hospital investigation found, maybe involving patients who had already been moved or released before her tactics were exposed. The Blackwood event signaled the start of a lengthy, gradual collapse for the Fairmount Medical Institute itself. Rumors proliferated among Philadelphia's medical community, despite the hospital board's intention that the subject would remain confidential in order to preserve the institution's reputation. Private doctors' referrals steadily declined, as many of them favored sending patients to more recent facilities with fewer problematic pasts. Rather of being the esteemed private institution it had been, Fairmount was largely acting as an overflow facility for the city's public hospitals by the 1920 seconds. After a 3-month administrative vacation, Dr. William Thorne, who had been in charge of the East Wing during Blackwood's tenure, was eventually brought back, but he was given more responsibility and moved to the West Wing with male patients. According to hospital records, the Blackwood case's shadow never entirely disappeared from his career. Citing health issues, he announced his early retirement in 1921. He made a passing reference to the events of 1,913 inches, a letter to a colleague that has been preserved in the Pennsylvania Hospital archives. One cannot help but wonder how many warning signs were missed through complacency or overconfidence. The responsibility of oversight is a burden I find increasingly difficult to bear. Fairmount was home to Administrator Charles Winslow until his retirement in 1922. A private journal in which he occasionally mused on the Blackwood case is among his personal materials that were presented to the Historical Society upon his passing. In 1919 he wrote, "6 years on, I remain troubled by our response to the B situation. While our intentions were to protect the institution and its patients from scandal, I fear we may have protected the wrong party. The absence of formal accountability creates a lingering unease. There are nights I wonder where she is now, and if others have suffered because we chose institutional reputation over wider responsibility." This entry implies that he had grown to regret the board's decision to handle the matter internally. Despite multiple purpose modifications throughout the years, the actual Fairmount Medical Institute building remained at its North Broad Street location until 1968. It was transformed into a general medical center, without any specific mental services during the 1,930 seconds. It briefly functioned as a rehabilitation facility for injured soldiers during World War II. It gradually lost both reputation and occupancy in the post-war years, as it found it difficult to compete with newer, more contemporary hospitals. The once grand building was in poor condition by the 1,960 seconds, with whole portions closed off for maintenance. Few Philadelphians lamented the building's demise when it was eventually planned to be demolished in 1968 to make room for an office complex. Most had forgotten what it had meant in the past, or what had happened inside its walls. The story was only resurrected after more than 50 years, when Blackwood's secret journal and the patient belongings were accidentally found during the demolition. Medical historians and ethicists became interested in the case again after the finding. The historical organization made the documents available to Thomas Harker, a graduate student who had been studying the history of Philadelphia medical facilities for his PhD thesis. In 1969, his follow-up article, The Blackwood Case, Institutional Failure and Unauthorized Experimentation in Early 20th Century Psychiatric Care, which was published in the Journal of Medical History, raised awareness of what had hitherto been merely sporadic newspaper reports and local rumors. Beyond the journal itself, Harker's research included interviews with surviving people who had ties to Fairmount throughout the pertinent time period, hospital records, and private letters. Most importantly, he tracked down and spoke with Catherine Palmer, a former patient of Blackwood's who was still residing in the Philadelphia region. Important eyewitness testimony regarding the character of Blackwood's treatments and their psychological effects was given by Palmer, who was by then time in her 80 seconds. Palmer claims that Blackwood's strategies centered on taking advantage of and escalating the innate susceptibility of patients who were already dealing with mental health issues. "She would wake us in the middle of the night when the mind is most defenseless," Palmer said. Sometimes she would simply stand silently beside the bed for long periods, watching until you became aware of her presence. Other times she would speak immediately, in a soft, measured voice that somehow seemed to bypass normal hearing and enter directly into the mind. Palmer explained how Blackwood would progressively persuade patients that their thoughts were being heard or seen by others, which was a terrible idea for people who were already worried about their mental health. "She would tell me things about myself that I hadn't shared with anyone. At Fairmount, details about my family, my fears, my past. I later realized she must have been reading our mail or speaking to relatives during visiting hours, but in my exhausted and confused state, it seemed like proof she could truly see inside my mind." Convincing patients that Blackwood alone could assist them in managing this fictitious ailment was another example of psychological manipulation. She presented it as a special kind of treatment not available to everyone, Palmer said. She said only certain patients showed the necessary receptivity, and that we were fortunate she had identified us. She claimed the regular doctors couldn't help with this particular problem, which was why the treatments had to be conducted at night, outside normal hospital routines. This mix of horror and promised salvation proved devastatingly effective for patients who were already cut off from their regular support networks and reliant on hospital personnel for basic necessities. You began to believe that she was the only one who could protect you from your thoughts being exposed, Palmer stated. Even when part of you recognized the manipulation, the fear she had created was so powerful that you complied simply to avoid what seemed like a worse alternative. Depending on the patient and their degree of resistance, Blackwood's physical therapy seemed to differ. Palmer was among many who cited mostly psychological strategies, such as isolation, lack of sleep, and continuous verbal reinforcement of the notion that their minds were flawed or hazardous. Others, like Elizabeth Harrow, reported more intrusive methods, such as anonymous injections that caused disorientation, prolonged constraint, and in certain instances, what Harrow called physical discomforts, meant to enhance receptivity to suggestion. Blackwood's stated goal of dismantling the patient's psychological autonomy and substituting fear-based submission was what connected these reports. According to Palmer, she wanted to remake us into what she believed was a better version, quiet, obedient, without the emotional responses that had brought us to Fairmount in the first place. She called this stabilization, but what she meant was surrender. The institutional shortcomings that had let Blackwood's operations to go unchallenged for so many months were also clarified by Harker's investigation. As a cost-cutting move, night monitoring in the East Wing had been lowered in January 1913 based on the idea that patients would be sleeping and would need little attention. According to hospital staffing statistics, the on-call doctor usually stayed in the West Wing and only came to the East Wing when called upon. As a result, Blackwood was able to effectively control patient care for prolonged periods of time. Furthermore, Fairmount's record-keeping system was easily manipulated. Physicians only looked at patient charts on official rounds. Nurses were mostly responsible for updating them. This allowed Blackwood to carry out her unapproved research without leaving a paper trail while recording traditional therapies. The era's loosely regulated dispensary system made it reasonably easy for a senior nurse to acquire or divert supplies without setting off alarms when drugs were involved. Most notably, the early 20th century healthcare system's cultural respect to medical authority fostered an atmosphere in which patients' complaints of abuse were frequently written off as hallucinations or disorientation brought on by their illnesses. As Dr. Rebecca Levine pointed out in her 1972 examination of the matter, the cruel irony is that the very symptoms that might alert observers to abuse anxiety, fear of specific staff members, sleep disturbances, increased emotional distress were often interpreted as confirmation of the original diagnosis rather than as potential indicators of mistreatment. Even the hospital's own investigation after Blackwood's disappearance was characterized by this rejection of patient evidence. Minutes of board meetings reveal that although Nurse Winter's confirmation of Elizabeth Harrow's story gave it some credibility, other patients' accounts were viewed with considerable skepticism. A board member has been heard saying, "We must remember that many of these women are in our care precisely because they experience reality in distorted ways. Their perceptions cannot be relied upon with the same confidence we would give to observations from sound minds." In the early 20th century, when the line between legitimate mental illnesses and socially unacceptable behaviors or feelings was frequently blurred, especially for women, this basic disrespect for patient testimony was a reflection of broader attitudes toward mental disease. Instead of serious mental illnesses that might have affected their capacity to effectively describe their experiences, many of Blackwood's victims had been admitted for what are now understood to be transient or situational mental health issues, such as bereavement reactions, depression, or anxiety. What sufferers like Harrow and Palmer had been saying for decades was vitally validated in 1968 with the discovery of Blackwood's journal, The Professional. Dispassionate explanations of subject progress and resistance reduction techniques in the journal provided hard proof that immoral and illegal behaviors had definitely occurred at Fairmount. This affirmation provided a sense of vindication for the few victims who were still alive in the late 1960s, but it came too late to bring about any real justice. The Blackwood case emerged as a significant point of reference in conversations about patient rights, medical ethics, and institutional accountability in the years after Harker's research was published. It was used as a case study in medical ethics classes at a number of colleges to illustrate how oversight shortcomings, unbridled power, and the rejection of patient testimony may foster abusive situations. Arguments for greater openness in healthcare organizations, more effective patient advocacy programs, and more reliable channels for voicing and looking into complaints about medical professionals have all referenced this case. The case also reignited curiosity about whether Blackwood had moved on from Philadelphia and pursued her activities elsewhere. After October 1913, Harker and other researchers tried to follow her whereabouts, looking through documents in New York, Boston, Chicago, and other large places where she might have applied for jobs in hospitals. These efforts were hampered by the widespread practice of the time, which was for nurses to work under somewhat different names at different stages of their careers, as well as by the fact that many early 20th century institutions had lost or incomplete employment records. The aforementioned Boston case of Eleanor Black in 1927 and the records of a nurse with comparable qualifications employed at a private sanatorium north of Chicago from 1914 to 1916 were two of the encouraging clues that surfaced. But in these cases, Blackwood's identity was never proven beyond a reasonable doubt. After the late 1922s, the trail becomes progressively colder, indicating that she might have moved to an area with laxer record-keeping, retired, or passed away. Blackwood's actions had far-reaching effects that went well beyond the victims she physically injured. The covered-up scandal's long-term effects were a factor in the Fairmount Medical Institute's final collapse. The case demonstrated to the medical community how institutional culture could permit abuse even in seemingly respectable facilities. In the context of psychiatric care in general, the Blackwood case was one of several historical instances that stoked growing doubt about institutional treatment and ultimately aided in the mid-20th century reform and deinstitutionalization campaigns. A letter Elizabeth Harrow addressed to Catherine Palmer in 1935, 2 years before to Harrow's death from pneumonia, may be the most moving part of the case. The letter, which was later placed in the possession of the museum, begins with the following sentence: "Even now, more than 20 years later, I sometimes wake in the night, convinced I can hear her footsteps in the hallway. The rational part of my mind knows this is impossible, that I am safe in my own home, yet the fear she planted remains, dormant but never fully eradicated. I wonder how many others carry similar shadows within them, their minds forever altered by what was done to them in the name of treatment." This, I believe, is her true crime, not just the immediate suffering she caused, but the lingering echoes of fear that continue long after the direct harm has ended. There is no memorial or marker commemorating the events that took place at Fairmount Medical Institute. Instead, the site is now a contemporary office complex. The journal and related materials are the sole tangible relics of the Blackwood case. They are kept in the archives of the Philadelphia Historical Society and are rarely consulted by scholars, but are mostly forgotten by the general public. The tale of Nurse Blackwood and her unapproved experiments has been forgotten in favor of more recent disputes and worries, much like many other troubling periods in medical history. However, the case serves as a powerful warning to those who research the history of psychiatric care or medical ethics. It serves as a reminder of how vulnerable patients can be when they are in the care of people with unbridled authority, and how institutional priorities can occasionally take precedence over the welfare of patients. Even if certain procedures and therapies have changed over the years, the issues it brings up regarding supervision, responsibility, and the care of people with mental illness are still pertinent. An ironic conclusion to the Blackwood case is that in the early 1970s, a mental health advocacy group that aimed to improve oversight of psychiatric facilities and establish patient rights partially occupied the office building built on the site of the former Fairmount Medical Institute. It's unclear if the organization knew about the site's past, But for the women who had endured there decades before, their presence was a kind of advancement that arrived too late. Some questions unavoidably remain as we wrap up this analysis of one of Philadelphia's most unsettling medical mysteries. What happened to Eleanor Blackwood after she left Fairmount? Did she carry on treating patients elsewhere, possibly improving her techniques in light of the knowledge she had gained from her 14 Philadelphia subjects? In other institutions that, like Fairmount, prioritized institutional prestige over accountability and openness, how many additional vulnerable patients might have suffered while in her care? There may never be a complete answer to these questions. Early 20th century organizations were frequently more interested in hiding issues than recording them for later research. Records from the time are insufficient, and many possible witnesses have long since died. Nevertheless, it is evident that Nurse Blackwood's story is more than a single instance of a disturbed person. It is a prime example of systemic shortcomings that permitted patient testimony to be disregarded, abuse to go unnoticed, and eventually, accountability to be evaded. The Blackwood case serves as a reminder to contemporary medical professionals and institutions that providing ethical care calls for more than just sophisticated facilities or technical know-how. It necessitates strict supervision, regard for patient autonomy, and a will to face, rather than hide, difficult realities. At Fairmount, the diary concealed behind the false wall serves as a tangible representation of how organizations occasionally isolate problematic information, keeping it buried rather than dealing with the underlying problems it exposes. Considerable progress has been achieved in patient rights, medical supervision, and mental health treatment methods in the years since the Blackwood case was made public. In contrast to the experimental, intuition-driven methods that defined previous eras, modern psychiatric care places a greater emphasis on patient dignity, informed consent, and evidence-based interventions. Perhaps most significantly, patient testimony is now more widely accepted as valuable and legitimate rather than being written off as fundamentally untrustworthy. Regulatory entities now offer external accountability, which was mainly lacking in 1913. Vulnerabilities still exist, though, especially for people whose institutional placement or mental health issues make them reliant on caregivers and cut off from outside assistance. Even though contemporary precautions have helped to lessen the underlying power disparity between patients and healthcare practitioners, abuse is still possible when those safeguards are ineffective or are evaded. The building is gone, its bricks and mortar scattered, but the human dynamics that made what happened inside possible: authority without accountability, vulnerability without protection, institutional preservation over individual justice remain potential threats wherever care is provided, without adequate oversight and respect for human dignity. As darkness descends on the site of the former Fairmount Medical Institute, now altered by decades of urban development, one might imagine the echoes of those distant footsteps that haunted Elizabeth Harrow's dreams, the deliberate tread of a nurse moving purposefully through darkened corridors, seeking out those she deemed in need of her special treatments. In this way, the Blackwood case continues to be more than simply a historical curiosity. It serves as a pertinent cautionary tale about the need for constant attention to safeguard the weak. Although the sounds within the walls of historic hospitals like Fairmount have long since died down, the lessons learned from this case continue to reverberate into the present, reminding us that the best defense against abuse is not merely improved regulations, but also a deep-seated dedication to recognizing the humanity in the people we purport to assist and a readiness to hear vulnerable voices when they attempt to convey difficult realities.